So a couple of things just briefly. One, I think that what we need desperately today are communities that serve as what a psychologist named Winnicott would call holding environments, or what Pope Francis might call communities of accompaniment. We need communities where people are able to be in transition, when people are able to sort of work through their questions and their difficulties. And unfortunately, we don't have a lot of those. At least this is my impression, and this would be verified in some studies that have been done. There's a somewhat well-known study done a number of years back called Going, Going, Gone, about young people who have left the Catholic Church. And one of the themes that came up in that study was that very often young people's questions were not being answered. They had very serious questions about their faith tradition, about life, and they weren't finding good answers. They weren't receiving good answers from the authority figures. Very often their questions were simply dismissed or ignored. And that simply is insufficient in today, because people have questions. They are struggling through this, and we need to create places where people can work through those questions and support each other in that transition. Another thing that I think would be really important for our communities today is encouraging the vocation of artists and engaging with art, literature, film, these sorts of things. And I think this is important because I believe that it really is first and foremost our artists. It is art that forms our worldviews. I think that, as important as philosophy and theology and those sort of things are, I think they're secondary, because it's when we inherit these kind of images and stories from our artists and authors, those are the things that create a world for us to dwell in. So those are a couple of brief suggestions, but what my book is mostly about, and what I want to spend the rest of the time on, is talking about Catholic education and the role that that can play in supporting people in making meaning today. So, as I said, I think one of the ways that Catholic education has fallen down in recent time is that we have not recognized sufficiently that people are meaning makers. People are not passive receptacles for information, and if we really hope to be passing on something that is living and meaningful for people, we need to recognize that people are actively doing this work of making meaning, and we need to support them in that. So first step towards that is understanding how, as human beings, we construct meaning. I think something that's crucial about this that I've already hinted at is that meaning making is primarily the work of the imagination. So again, for the Lonerganians, think about Lonergan saying that the image leads to the insight, or the insight comes out of the image. Again, for Kerr fans out there, he says that it is the symbol that gives rise to thought. So just in terms of how human cognition works, it's really through our experiences that we form mental images. And these are sort of the basic building blocks of thought and meaning for us, are these mental images. It's upon that foundation of those mental images that we begin to form concepts that we're able to reason, but we need that foundation. And on the other hand, when it comes to actually living, to envisioning a life for ourselves, we need to have some kind of vision. We don't act in a meaningful sort of way without a vision of what we are going to do. And so it's problematic if education is only operating on this level of abstraction, of concepts, of reasoning. That's important. I don't want to dismiss that. But if we're going to do this harder work of helping people to construct meaning for their lives, we need to get down to a deeper level, to that level of the imagination, where people are forming those mental images, because that's where deep meaning is generated. Ed Foley talks about deep symbols. Sandra Schneider talks about master images that guide our lives. We can talk about sort of master narratives. Those are productions of the imagination, and that's where education needs to work if we're really going to help people to live meaningful lives. So, having dug into the research in this and always trying to be a better teacher myself, over the years, including the time I've been teaching in the Corps, I've sort of worked out this pedagogical approach that I have seen to be very helpful to students in being able to construct more meaning for their lives. So I use this acronym of C to sort of guide me in this. So, recognizing that people are trying to form some kind of vision for their life. I like the visual metaphor. But these three letters, SEE, stand for these three movements of stimulating the imagination, expanding the imagination, and embracing new ways of imagining. So right now I put a link into the post to a website or to a web page that sort of lays out these three steps. So people are welcome to follow along there as I'm talking through these. All right, so these three steps. The first is stimulating the imagination. You can't shape clay that's already been set. And the same, to a certain extent, is true for human minds, human imaginations. That for meaning to be generated, the mind needs to be active. The imagination needs to be stimulated. Often it is some kind of direct personal experience that does that. And so things like service learning are incredibly beneficial in this regard. Also, we have people here like Juan Rios at Seton Hall who are doing work with virtual reality, which I think has a lot of potential here as well. But even more simply, as teachers, we can just raise questions that dig into students' experiences, about what they're experiencing in life, about assumptions they might bring to the classroom, about their mental images. But the idea here is just to get the wheels turning. Unless their minds are active, unless they're digging into their own experiences and images, it's really hard to generate anything meaningful without that first happening. So this is this first step, is stimulating the imagination. The second is expanding the imagination. So I think what we've seen in a modern era is a lot of people have rejected these bearers of meaning that we inherited from religious traditions, is that it's really hard to create meaning ex nihilo. In fact, I think it's impossible, that we never just construct a meaning out of thin air. We're always borrowing from the stories and symbols and rituals of the culture and the traditions in which we're embedded. And so I think it's helpful to pay attention to this in the way that we teach, that in order to construct meaning, we need to encounter something that is meaningful, something that helps us to make sense where we couldn't make sense of things before. And so this is why I think things like a core curriculum are so important, where students come into contact with classic texts. Texts that are classic in the sense that David Tracy would explain. We recognize that something of momentous importance is here. That's something that could potentially affect my life. So these kind of texts, but also Christian art and music, stories, rituals, practices, and also the people who we encounter, who we sense that this person is more alive. There is wisdom in this person. We need to have these kind of encounters in order to borrow that meaning that we can begin to build upon. But sometimes our inadequate meanings also have to be disrupted or challenged. So if you think, I mentioned positivism earlier. St. Augustine is someone who fell to this earlier in life, that he couldn't think of God or anything else in existence except for in material terms. But he eventually realized that was inadequate, that reality was larger than what he could touch and see. We might also think about some of the racial biases that we sometimes bring to the classroom and bring to our lives. These are inadequate meanings that need to be disrupted in order for a more adequate meaning to be constructed. So finally, the second E is embracing new ways of imagining. Nothing becomes meaningful for us unless we own it, unless we make it our own. So, even if we are exposed to the meanings of others, we need to synthesize this for ourselves. We need to integrate this with what we already believe, with our existing master images. And this involves doing the work of making personal judgments about, this is what Jesus says leads to fullness of life. Do I think this is true? Is this true in my own experience? So making a personal judgment, and also ultimately a decision to act upon what I am recognizing as meaningful. This involves envisioning a way forward and actually acting upon that. So this is what my research and my teaching have led me to recognize, that that these are three really crucial moments in the way that we construct meaning for our lives. And in order to really be of help to especially our young people today, educators need to be more intentional about guiding learners through these movements, of doing this work in a more intentional and deliberate manner. One thing I point out in my book is that actually, even though Jesus didn't have the benefit of all this modern cognitive science, we see him going through just these kind of movements, especially in the way that he told stories, that he told parables. And I found this to be very effective in my own teaching. So again, there's a lot more details and examples in the book. There are some things in the website that I shared in the chat. But these three movements I see as being really important. So thinking about our setting here at Seton Hall, I think the courses that we teach in the core, but also in religion, in Catholic studies, theology, philosophy, these are really ideal opportunities to dig into this work of meaning making and to support students in that. But I wouldn't limit it to those kind of classes. I think there are many opportunities in a university setting. And that might be something that would be interesting for us to talk about in the Q&A. What might be the possibilities at a place like Seton Hall? So let me just summarize and wrap up, because I'm tired of hearing myself talk. So the postmodern world makes it hard for us to make sense of life. There are just so many challenges. There's so much thrown at us. It's more than most of us are really equipped to handle at present. And this has huge consequences. I think this contributes to the reason to people disaffiliating, to leaving behind old religious traditions, because they're not finding meaning there. And I think this is a big contributing factor to the decline in mental health that we've been seeing in the past decade or so. So for me, this really raises up a crucial task of education, including religious education, theological education. We need to help learners to develop these kind of habits of post-critical meaning-making that will enable them to realize that promise that Jesus offered of fullness of life. So I've written this book, and I hope it provides a hopeful model for this, or at least a starting point for a conversation about how we can do better for our students. So with that, I will wrap up and be very happy to talk with people about your ideas and hear people's questions.